really just want you to leave the quotes and just look at the order of events that I've listed here. So these are key events that will occur after Christ returns, and they're only just the ones relating to the Jews. So I haven't listed everything that's going to happen. I'm just trying to focus on the ones that relate to the natural Jews because they're what we're going to be looking at in these chapters today. So we just quickly run down them. When Christ returns and the judgment seat has happened, the saints are immortalised, the Goian invasion has happened, the Jews that are in the land already, because they've been already appearing, of course, over the last 120-something years, returning there from various nations, as we all witnessed. When Gog comes down and takes the land, as I just mentioned before, 2/3 of the Jews in the land will be killed. Half of the Jews that are in Jerusalem will be taken captive. And that's when Christ and the saints intervene. Now, there's sort of two streams of activity that happen a bit in parallel. Sometimes the timing of this is a little bit hard to be completely certain about, but this is a fairly good guess. So when the Immortal Saints leave Mount Sinai, some of them go with Elijah to then start gathering the Jews that are still amongst the nations that haven't yet returned, whereas other saints go with Christ into the land and defeat the Goian Confederacy. And of course, there's an enormous earthquake at the same time, and the whole land of Israel's topography is changed around. So Mount Zion's elevated and there's a big plain around it. And this great earthquake assists in the subduing of the Goian Confederacy. And Christ and the saints are able to rescue some of the Jews that have been taken captive. So at this point, we've got still some residual Jews left in the land, and they are then converted to Christ. They've finally witnessed for the first time him in person. They can't deny that this man is, in fact, the Messiah after all. He's immortal. He's right there in front of them. And the saints who are immortal are with him, and they've rescued them from the Goian host. So the Jews are finally converted to Christ, and then they, at that point, take the area of the promised land that had been given to them under Abraham for so long ago, as described in Ezekiel chapter 48 with those 12 cantons. And the land is cleansed at that time as well from the remnants of the Battle of Armageddon, and also religiously cleansed as well of all false religion. Then the rest of the world is challenged by Christ to submit to his rule, and some do and some don't. And so there are then a second series of wars in the world in which the remaining nations of the world are subdued, and at the same time the Jews that are still amongst those nations, as opposed to ones that are already in the land from the return before Christ's return, are then gathered by Elijah and the saints, and they go through what's called in Ezekiel chapter 20 the wilderness of the people, and the rebels are purged out, as it's described in that verse. So some are cleansed, some refuse to accept the message that's presented to them, and those that do are then brought into the land of Israel. And then for the first time, we've got all of the Jews in the world, both those that were still amongst the nations and those that were already in the land at Christ's return, united together as one combined nation for the first time. So there's multiple battles and multiple returns, and you just need to sort of see that sequence so that as we look at these verses, you can sort of see which are talking about which. So please don't look at the quotes up or anything like that. That's just for reference if you wanted to look at them later. But the key thing I want you to take from now is just that approximate order, taking into account the fact that the second point there, the timing of that is somewhat uncertain. All right, so let's continue then looking at Ezekiel 36. So we start at verse 25. And verse 25 says, "Then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean. From all your filthiness and from all your idols will I cleanse you." So the Jews have already been brought back to the land in verse 24. So the previous verses showed quite clearly that they didn't return to the land after they were already converted to Christ. God says, "I didn't bring you back because of what you've done," verse 22. but I did it for my name's sake. And so verse 24, he brings them back into the land, and then verse 25 says, I will sprinkle clean water upon you and you shall be clean. So their conversion to Christ occurs after they've returned to the land. And this is alluded to by Brother Thomas in that quite frequently quoted reference from Elpis Israel. There is then a partial and primary restoration of the Jews before the manifestation of Christ, which is to serve as the nucleus or basis of future operations in the restoration of the rest of the tribes after Christ has appeared in the kingdom. So the initial restoration is before Christ returns, and that then is used, the restoration of the Jews in the land, as part of the process of getting the remaining Jews back into the land later after the Goian invasion. And as I said earlier, it's wonderful to be at this point of history where we can now look back over 125 years and see that that has started happening already. The Jews, of course, have been returning gradually since the late 1800s, particularly since the Zionist Congress in 1897, but even very limited degree before that as well. And we can actually see these things happening with our very eyes. It's just a sort of foretaste of what's going to happen to an even greater extent in the future. Verse 26 and 27, a new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I'll give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and keep my judgments, and do them. So this is the Jews recognising for the first time that Christ is their Messiah, understanding for the first time the Old Testament scriptures that they've studied in such microscopic detail, but without fully comprehending. They're now part of the new covenant in Christ and do away with the old covenant of the law. And interestingly, this little picture here of the idea of a new spirit is not the first time Ezekiel has used this. So if you turn back to Ezekiel chapter 11, you can see that this little figure was actually introduced by Ezekiel much earlier in the prophecy when he was describing the judgments upon Judah and Jerusalem. So if we have a look at Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 16, this is a really good one to put in your margin alongside this. So Ezekiel 11, verse 16, although I have cast them far away among the heathen and although I have scattered them among the countries, yet will I be to them as a little sanctuary in the countries where they come. Therefore say, thus saith the Lord God, I will even gather you from the people, assemble you out of the countries whither I have scattered you, and give you the land of Israel. And they shall come thither, and they shall take away all the detestable things thereof, and all the abominations thereof from thence. And I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within you, and will take the stony heart out of their flesh, and give them an heart of flesh. So that verse there is almost word for word from the one we just looked at in Ezekiel 36, verse 26. That they may walk in my statutes, keep my ordinances, and do them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. We might just stop there just for time. So you can see that even though this section, Ezekiel 11, was in the section that related to the judgments upon Jerusalem and Judah, which we had to spend a long time going through because it's heavily emphasised in the book for good reason, Ezekiel just gave them, or God gave them through Ezekiel, just a little taste of the fact that that wasn't going to be the way their future would remain. And just briefly talks about it here in Ezekiel 11. And so now in this new section of the prophecy, which is all about the restoration, he then picks up that little image and expands it greatly right through for the rest of chapter 36. So you'll see that the concept of what's covered in verse 25 and 6 of Ezekiel 36 then continues right through the rest of the chapter and expands on what was just summarised back in chapter 11. So it would have been wonderful for Ezekiel, having previously had to say only a little about that in a time of judgment, to be able to now expand out upon that to his hearers after by this time Jerusalem had actually fallen. He was able to give them a much bigger picture of that time of the restoration. Verse 28 goes on to say, "And ye shall dwell in the land that I gave your fathers, and ye shall be my people, and I will be your God." Now that language should sound familiar to us. And if you didn't see the slide already, this is where it comes back from. It's drawing all the way back to the promises to Abraham, where God says to Abraham, "I will give thee into thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." And this verse has both those elements, dwelling in the land and being their God. So Ezekiel's being told here what's happening at this time to Israel isn't just a short-term local moment of improvement. This is the ultimate fulfillment of what I've been saying to you for centuries. This is fulfillment of what I promised to Abraham. And I'm going to pick up that language and use it as part of this picture for that reason. And this is because the promise to Abraham is all based on faith, the new covenant, rather than what they were accepting at the time was the law, which is, of course, not based on faith but on works. And if you want to look in your own time at Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10 and 13, verse 1, that actually describes the conversion of... Actually, no, we will just quickly have a look at it now. It's not going to take us too long to just flip over there. So let's just have a quick look at Zechariah 12, verse 10. Because this is a very clear description of the conversion of the Jews to Christ. Zechariah 12, verse 10. I might stay back at verse 9 just to show the historical context is appropriate. "And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that are come against Jerusalem." So there's the defeat of the Goian Confederacy. And then after that, the rescued Jews are then, as we saw in that sequence, converted to Christ. And in verse 10, it goes on to describe that. "And I will pour upon the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications. And they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn." And then it goes on to continue that description through to the end of the chapter and into the start of the next as well. So returning back to chapter 36, we can then see in verse 29 and 30 that in addition to the spiritual regeneration of the people, that's paralleled by a literal regeneration of the land. It's become fertile and well-watered. For instance, verse 30, "I will multiply the fruit of the tree and increase the field," etc. And that happens, it's mentioned again later. For instance, verse 35, "This land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste and desolate ruined cities have become fenced and inhabited." So it's really interesting that even now, when the Jews have returned to the land to a limited degree today, that's happening to a small extent. The Jews have done an amazing job with their various irrigation schemes of bringing life back to a land that was previously very desolate under the Turks. And before that, there were large amounts of the land that were either uninhabited altogether or in a very degraded state agriculturally. But since the Jews have returned, they have brought it back to life. But that's only a limited fulfilment of what will happen to an even greater extent when Christ returns, because we know that when the earthquake happens and the land is rearranged, there's going to be the rivers that flow out of Mount Zion into the Dead Sea where it's healed, and then there's rivers in the desert, and the desert blossoms as a rose. And so to an even greater extent than the Jews have done so far now, the land will be regenerated to an amazing extent. And it'll be like, as it said in verse 35, the Garden of Eden, even greater than anything that mortal Jews can do today. And that, of course, was part of what was promised right from the start by Moses during the wilderness wanderings, and the blessings and the cursings in Leviticus 26 verse 4, for instance, that if they obeyed God, God would bless them with prosperity in their land. And continuing verse 35, we can see here that one of the results of this is that the people around the Jews, the Gentiles, look at all this and finally have to acknowledge that Yahweh was the true God, because he had promised that the Jews would be restored centuries in the past, and they could not now deny that that was the case. The regathered Jews are in the land, they've been converted to Christ, and their land is a Garden of Eden restored. And just as he said would happen, it has happened. And particularly the phrase in verse 38, "You shall know that I am Yahweh," which has been repeated a number of times through this passage of Ezekiel, or this section of Ezekiel, has a very appropriate application to this. This is a great little slide that Brother Alfrey's got in his book, which just really shows clearly how the name of Yahweh that had been profaned, and which he's now showing is no longer the case, the name of Yahweh is absolutely linked to the restoration of the Jews into their land. Because when it was first revealed to Moses in Exodus 6, Yahweh says 7 things, all to do with, so that's the covenant number, that he was going to do in line with his name. I will be, he who will be. So he goes on to say what those 7 things were. That they would bring the Israelites out of the burdens of Egypt, rid them out of their bondage, redeem them, take them to him for a people, be to him for a God, bring them into the land and give it to them for an heritage. I am Yahweh. So Yahweh, describing his name with the very meaning of he who will be, describes it in terms of a restoring of the people from Gentile lands back to the land that they were promised, with an initial application obviously to the Jews coming out of Egypt, but also ultimately to the Jews coming from all nations to their land forever, not just temporarily when they came out of Egypt. So it's very appropriate that when he says, I'm going to do this for my holy name's sake, I'm going to bring the Jews out of the land and plant them in there, that links perfectly with what his name actually stood for right from the start. So when he says that, that's why he did it. And so all the nations could no longer deny that God, the true God, was Yahweh, and that the meaning of his name had in fact been fulfilled. Just a last note on verse 37 and 38, it's interesting that that chapter finishes with a reference to flocks. Verse 37, for instance, at the end of the verse says, I will increase them with men like a flock. And then verse 38, as the holy flock is the flock of Jerusalem in her solemn feasts, so shall the waste cities be filled with flocks of men, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. And where did we see flocks earlier in our Ezekiel series? Just recently. And we won't ask the speaker who gave it to answer that question. So somebody else. The shepherds, exactly, which was Ezekiel which chapter? 34, that's right. So right in the middle of this section of restoration of the Jews. So the themes are continuing as the successive prophecies are given. We might have them separated by weeks or fortnights through Bible class, but to Ezekiel and to God they're all one. All right, so we now move on to chapter 37. Now, chapter 37 we could describe as the vision of the dry bones and the parable of the 2 sticks. So there's 2 key components in the chapter. The vision of the dry bones is from verses 1 to 14. So just scan your eyes down there and you'll see that by the time you get to the end of verse 14, it's the end of the description of the vision, the interpretation of the vision. And then verse 15 starts, the word of Yahweh came unto me saying, Son of man, take thee 1 stick. And so a new vision begins at that point, or actually more like a parable, and the description of that and its interpretation then continues through the rest of the chapter. So that's quite a handy little framework to have. So within each of those 2 sections, the vision is described from verse 1 to 10. And then if you look at verse 11, you can then see that he describes the fulfilment of the vision. What was actually going to happen? Verse 11, then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. So for the first time, Ezekiel was told what this vision about the dry bones is actually about. He's previously to that just had it described to him without explanation. And then we'll see the same thing happens in the parable. It's just described for a couple of verses, and then from verse 18 onwards, he then describes the meaning of that parable. All right, so if we start with the vision of the dry bones, I feel that, along with a lot of Christadelphian expositors, this section of the chapter, the vision of the dry bones, does include events that we're seeing in the world now, where the Jews are being returned to the land, but certainly includes as well the continued return of the land, of the Jews to the land after the return of Christ as well, incorporating both aspects of that return. And also in the case of the dry bones, the destruction of the Jewish state by Gog as well, before it is then restored by Christ. Brother Allfrey has a slightly different approach, and relates the entire of chapter 37 only to events after the Goian invasion. I personally think that's just a little bit too limited in scope, just because if we look at what's happened in history already, we've had over 130 years of Jews returning to the land and the nation being effectively resurrected. And I think it's a bit too narrow to ignore that and not have any of this apply to that event or those events. But certainly it doesn't relate. I wouldn't argue at all that it relates only to that. It's clearly fulfilled significantly in the future as well. And I think while that's quite a commonly adopted position, including by Brother Thomas, I can see why Brother Allfrey's reached that position. There is some arguments that can be advanced in favour of his view, and he was also trying to avoid or counter a wrong view advocated by some at the time that the Arabs were in fact Gog, and apparently their argument in part involved applying all of Ezekiel 37 to events before the return of Christ. And so if he could show it wasn't that, but it was after, then it also addressed that other view. But I think possibly it's a bit of an overstep to have gone quite that far. But your views are welcome, and we can discuss it after if you wish. All right, so this is an amazing chapter. Really, Ezekiel is shown a resurrection in type, in vision. You know, he doesn't experience a resurrection, but he sees something that's almost like a resurrection. But it's just a resurrection of a whole group of people rather than an individual person being resurrected. And while we don't have time to look at this tonight, you might want to just jot down in your margin that it has a few parallels to another prophecy in Hosea, chapter 6, verse 1 to 3. And without turning to it now, I'll just explain briefly why there's a connection there, and that is that in Hosea, he talks about Israel after 2 days being revived and in the third day being raised up and living in God's sight. And so while it doesn't use the word resurrection, by mentioning something happening after 3 days, it obviously alludes to a resurrection and links that or parallels that with what was going to happen not just to Christ but also to Israel in a national sense. So for later consideration, you might like to have a look at some links between the way Hosea 6 and Ezekiel 37 work. All right, so the vision then, as you can see on the overview slide, is from verses 1 to 10. And if we just have a look through some aspects of this fairly briefly, firstly, it mentions there that we've got a valley full of dry bones in verse 1. And again, it mentions verse 2 of open valley. The Hebrew actually isn't as specific as valley, and it can just as easily be translated plain. And I think it's probably quite an appropriate alternative, actually, because back in Ezekiel, at the start of the book, in Ezekiel 3, he's taken to a plain and shown some of the original visions. So it would be sort of quite fitting if he saw some visions of judgment on a plain originally and was then later shown some visions of restoration on a plain to compensate for that as well. Or perhaps to complement it might be a better term. Now, if we look then through what's depicted, we see in verse 4 there's a whole group of dry bones, and Ezekiel is told to tell them that God was going to put breath into them and they would live. And verse 6, he would lay sinews upon them, bring up flesh upon you, cover you with skin, put breath in you, and you shall live, and know that I am Yahweh. And then in verse 7 to 9, he does what God had said. So he goes and commands these bones that he can see in this plain and says that should happen. And sure enough, it does. Verse 7, there's a shaking and the bones come together. Then the sinews and the flesh come upon them. Then the skin covers them, but there's no breath in them. Verse 8. And so then he has to do another thing, verse 9, which is to prophesy to the winds and say, come, O winds, and breathe upon these slain that they might live. And then verse 10, that happens. The breath comes into them and they stand up and become a great army. So there's sort of two stages there in what he sees happen. Now, a few comments about this. Firstly, it's interesting, Brother Orfrey makes this point as well. It's interesting that Ezekiel is part of what happens in this prophecy, in this vision. He's not just an observer, he's a participant as well. He has to say things to these bones in order for the things that he then sees to actually happen. And again, as has happened so many times in Ezekiel, we can see here that in verse 3, Ezekiel is referred to as Son of Man. And so for him to be doing these things and be called Son of Man, then what that's telling us is that God is saying that what is going to happen with these bones is going to be done through the agency of Christ. He's the Son of Man, the Son of Man. Ezekiel is just Son of Man, but he's clearly a type of Christ, as we've seen all the time through the book. And so whatever these bones represent is going to be, the resurrection of those bones represent, is going to involve the work of Jesus Christ. Now we know, of course, that verse 11, the first thing we're told about the fulfilment of this is that these bones are the whole house of Israel. So the restoration of the Jewish nation back to life again is going to be carried out by the work of Christ. And we can see how that has happened in more than one stage of history. Right now, he is clearly working to bring the Jews back to the land before his return. Since his ascension, he's the head of the angelic host, isn't he? And so he now is guiding all of the angels in all of their providential work throughout the world, in everything, including, therefore, the return of the Jews. So in this stage of the operation, Christ is in control. But even more so, and perhaps even more visibly so, when he returns and then helps in the regathering of the scattered Jews that are remaining outside of the land at his return, he will also be working through Elijah and the saints to gather them back into the land as well and create the ultimate conclusion of this vision, as we'll see subsequently. And even the Jews that have returned to the land now and that are plundered by Gog will themselves be rescued by Christ and the saints of his saw, and he will obviously therefore have a role in that aspect of the restoration too. So that mention of Ezekiel as participating in this vision, I think, is very significant, and particularly because he's labelled Son of Man in the process of that. So verse 3, for instance, and also verse 9, his title is used there again. Now, the next thing I think that's significant is that this resurrection happens in two stages. We saw that in verse 7, he prophesies to the bones, and they come together, and the flesh and the skin and everything comes upon them. But it especially says at the end of verse 8, there was no breath in them. And he has to then do another thing in verse 9, a second prophecy, in order for them to come to life. So Brother Allfrey's got this depicted in this slide here. So you've started getting the bones coming together, then the flesh comes on the bones, then the skin covers them, and then finally Spirit from God enters in and they stand up. Perhaps it would be nicer if this picture actually had him standing rather than sitting, but clearly he's standing, he's alive rather, and the Spirit of God's come into him. So, but you can see though there's two stages. So how might these two stages then apply? So we read the fulfilment then of this vision in verse 11 to 14. And he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off from our parts. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, cause you to come up out of your graves, and bring you into the land of Israel. And ye shall know that I am the Lord, when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves. And shall put my spirit in you, and you shall live, and shall place you in your own land. Then you shall know I, Yahweh, have spoken it and performed it, saith Yahweh. Now, some comments about this little bracket of verses. Just a quick note on the end of verse 11. We are cut off for our parts in the AV isn't particularly clear, but it really just means completely cut off or cut off indeed or something along those lines, as ESV and NASB and the Net Bible have. But getting back to the point about the two stages and what they represent. So this section, verse 11 to 14, interprets the vision for us. And when you look at the way this wording is given, it's fairly clear what these two stages must be, because we've, on the one hand, got what is initially just a dead body, and then it's a living body when it's been given God's Spirit. So when you look at the way this is worded, verse 12, it says, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. So the first stage, where the bodies come out of the graves, but they're not alive yet, because that happens in verse 14, is then brought into the land of Israel. So the dead body represents Jews going into the land but not yet being converted to Christ. Then, verse 14, you shall put my spirit in you and you shall live, then represents the Jews being converted to Christ and spiritually revived rather than just being physically revived. And the spiritual revival was very appropriately worded as shall put my spirit in you, because as we saw back in chapter 36, that same language of spirit, verse 27, was used to describe the cleansing of the nation, wasn't it? Verse 27, I will put my spirit within you. So I think there's a really clear link there. The dead body represents the Jews in unbelief, then the living body is the Jews in belief. And the order of the events is shown in the interpretation, where the restoring of the nation to the land is in verse 12, when they come out of their graves, and then verse 14, I'll put my spirit in you and you shall live, is when they are then converted. And just a quick note on the word, and I shall place you in your own land, which sounds a bit like the first stage again. The word place in the Hebrew doesn't mean just place like that, but it means to rest or settle down or remain. And so it's a result of their spiritual conversion that they will never leave their land again. It's not the process of putting them into the land. It means having got there, they're going to stay in peace and safety forever. So the Hebrew for place is just not particularly clearly conveyed by the King James there. So finally then we come to the parable of the two sticks from verse 15 to the end of the chapter. And as we saw in the overview, the parable itself is just from verse 15 to 17, and then the explanation of the parable, or the meaning of the parable, is then for the rest of the chapter. So let's just quickly read the parable. The word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Moreover, thou son of man, take thee one stick and write upon it for Judah and for the house of Israel his companions. Then take another stick and write upon it for Joseph the stick of Ephraim and for all the house of Israel his companions. and join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in thine hand. So Brother Orfrey's got a nice little diagram showing this one as well. So you can see how this all works. On the left-hand side, you've got the stick for the kingdom of Judah with the tribes of it written on it, and then the stick for the kingdom of Joseph, which is the northern 10 tribes, and they're separate. And then Ezekiel's told to put them together in his hand so that they're one. And this diagram shows more clearly how that could be done. So it could be, if they put end on end and you put your hand over the join, it looks like there's just one stick again, instead of two separate ones. If you hold them in any other way, that's not going to work. But if you do it like that, you could make it look like one stick. So what does all this then mean? I think the first thing that's interesting is why sticks with things written on them. And I don't know if that makes you think of anything yourself. Eventually it did for me, but it took quite a long time. Any ideas? Aaron's rod that budded, somebody said. Yep, that's right. So remember with Aaron's rod that budded in Numbers 17, after the Korah, Dathan and Abiram rebellion, each of the tribes was asked to bring a rod and write on that rod the name of their tribe. And so there ended up being 12 rods that got put in and then into the tabernacle, and then the next morning, one of them, the one for Levi with Aaron's name on it, was effectively resurrected because it sprouted forth almond leaves, or leaves, flowers rather, almond leaves. Aaron's rod that budded. So there's some clear links between that and this without being exactly the same. So I think it's designed to make the Jews think about it, because if you think back to Numbers 17, there was competition amongst the tribes as to which tribe was going to be the greatest, wasn't there? And the point of that exercise was to show that Aaron and the tribe of Levi were to be Aaron was to be the head of the priesthood, and it wasn't going to be taken by any other tribe. But this time, all of the two sticks are shown to be the same. None of them sprout, and they're combined into one, made to one look like one identical rod. And so I think what should have been triggered in their mind straight away is to think, well, this must be saying that now not only is there one, but we're all going to be at the same level. We don't have one of our own tribe as a separate Levitical priesthood like we did in the time of Moses. It's going to be something different. And of course there was, because the law of Moses and the Levites and the Levitical priesthood all went out the window, and they were, as we're going to see later in the chapter, reigned over by just one individual Christ, and all the immortals that weren't even from the 12 tribes of Israel in most cases. They were Gentiles that will be reigning over them. So it was supposed to be, I think, a contrast to what happened in the Aaron's rod that budded, to make them think, it's not going to be the same as what we had in the past. All right, so let's now look at the explanation of this parable. So firstly, we've got this idea of Judah, and then we've got this idea of Ephraim and Joseph being combined in some way. And if you look down in verse 22, it tells us in the explanation that this relates to two kingdoms, because verse 22 says, "And I will make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel. One king shall be king to them all, and they shall be no more two nations. Neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms any more at all." So obviously, historically, there used to be the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. But how do we apply this in this situation where we're talking about latter-day events? Because obviously in today's world, there's Jews from all sorts of tribes and they're all mixed up. There's no separate kingdom of Judah and separate kingdom of Israel. That all disappeared long ago. So in what sense do we understand the kingdom of Judah, or the nation of Judah and the nation of Israel/Joseph/Ephraim in a modern day sense or a latter day sense. So obviously they're used symbolically. The question is how. So what Brother Thomas and others have suggested very validly is that the term Judah represents the Jews that are in the land at the time of Christ's return, and the term Ephraim or Joseph represents the Jews that are still scattered amongst the nations at Christ's return. And why might that be the way it's split up? Well, it does make quite good sense. Oops, what's going on here? One of my slides has disappeared. Okay. It's gone. No. Sorry about that. I have to go back to where we are. There was another slide and I don't know what it is. We can describe it verbally. All right, so we've got Judah. If you think about why would Judah be the Jews that are already in the land? Well, after the Babylonian captivity, what tribe or kingdom was the one that returned back to the land after the Babylonian captivity? Was it the 10 tribes or was it the 2 tribes? Mostly the 2 tribes. It wasn't actually completely hard and fast. There was actually some mixing of the tribes between both groups. But predominantly, the 10 tribes were not returning because they'd already gone out with the Assyrian captivity and were scattered amongst the nations. It was the kingdom of Judah that was left that went to Babylon and therefore returned back to the land after the Babylonian captivity. So it would make sense to use the term Judah to describe Jews that had returned to the land first. And it's only later that the scattered tribes would return after the return of Christ, in fact. So on my missing slide, we had just sort of summarised that definition. Judah representing the Jews that had returned to the land before Christ's return, and Israel, Ephraim, Joseph representing those after Christ's return. And similar to the vision, again we have Ezekiel holding this stick in his hand himself. He's participating in the parable. He's the one that holds the 2 sticks and puts them as one in his hand, again showing that it's the work of Christ that makes all of this happen. And so continuing then through the interpretation, we can see then that the 2 sticks being combined is the Jews in the land and the Jews outside the land finally being brought together in verse 22 under one king. I will make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king to them all. So at the end of the second Exodus, the Jews that are returned to the land come through the wilderness of the people, converted by Elijah and the saints. They enter into the land of Israel as described in Isaiah 11 verse 15, which you don't have time to look at now. And now for the first time since right back in the time of David and Solomon, united under one king. You think about that historically, it's never been like that since the time of Rehoboam. And finally, they are all one nation again, just like was first constituted by God under Saul and David and Solomon in the land. But this time they're under Christ, of course, and not under a king like David or Solomon. And so in verse 24, it goes on to describe that. And David, my servant, shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. And so here we have the work of Christ as their king, depicted as David, very appropriately, being the subject of David's prophecies and promises, and he is king over them all. And they shall have one shepherd, which is another allusion back to Ezekiel 34, the good shepherd, and the sheep of that chapter. And they dwell together in the land. Now, interestingly, verse 25, you can see that they are definitely mortal Jews, because it says there, they shall dwell therein, they and their children and their children's children forever. So they are having, they're having families, which obviously immortals don't do, but they are part of the nucleus of the kingdom of God for the 1,000 years, and they are mortals, and therefore they do have families. Verse 26 describes the time of this kingdom as a time in which they would experience the covenant of peace, and it would be an everlasting covenant. This is alluding to the promise to David, isn't it? Because the promise to David, of course, already mentioning David in the verse before, is an everlasting covenant. God said to David that his throne would remain forever and that Christ would be on his throne forever. And it also says in the start of the promises to David, there's a little reference there just before the key section that we know, which talks about how how God would bring his people Israel to dwell in a place of their own and move no more, and the children of wickedness would not afflict them anymore. So they were in a peaceful state. The children of affliction would not afflict them, any wickedness would not afflict them anymore. So the promises to David are being fulfilled now just as much as the promises to Abraham that we looked at earlier in chapter 36. Another thing that's really appropriate, I think, about mentioning David, particularly in this context, is that what is happening here is actually like a fulfillment of what David himself experienced. If you think about what happened in David's kingdom, he initially only reigned over the tribe of Judah in Hebron. Then he was made king over the whole nation. And that's what's going to happen in a greater sense with Christ at his return as well. He'll initially reign just over the mortal Jews that are in the land at that time, that he rescues from Gog. And then later, when the other Jews are regathered from the nations via the second Exodus and gathered to the land, then he rules over all of them as one combined nation. So there's an exact parallel between what David experienced in his life and what Christ will do at his return. And so to then call Christ David himself in this place is very appropriate for that reason as well. And so we finish with the glorious words of verse 27 and 28, which bring together both the promises to David and the promises to Abraham. My tabernacle also shall be with them. Yea, I will be their God, and they shall be my people, which is the promise to Abraham we looked at earlier in chapter 36. And the heathen shall know that I, Yahweh, do sanctify Israel when my sanctuary shall be in the midst of them forevermore. Tabernacle and sanctuary, promises to David. I will build you a temple, a house for my name. So both of the promises are integrated there into one beautiful picture. And of course, Ezekiel goes on to describe that in far more detail, the sanctuary of Ezekiel's temple from chapter 40 to 48, how the whole book finishes. So this little picture here is expanded out greatly, which we'll look, God willing, at next year. But these beautiful words are not just relevant to the mortal Jews. They apply just as much to the Gentiles as well. They have been broadened out in the future to all the brothers and sisters who accept the work of Christ, and even, of course, therefore, to us as well. And so I'd like to just finish with the beautiful words of Revelation 21 verse 3, which picks up this exact language, but now includes us in it as well. Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them, and be their God. Thank you.